It is Friday, and we are working for Crusoe Friday, July 5th, 2024. In Los Angeles, he is Sam Park. In Los Angeles, I am John Ramey, opting for an al fresco recording on this beautiful Friday morning. We have the French election, round one done, round deux on Sunday. A gory Tory result in the United Kingdom. And a new chapter in the Bolivian coup, and we will discuss a coup is nothing new for the Bolivian people. But let us begin in the United Kingdom. My partner is a dual citizen. She is British and American, and so I have grabbed the most British mug I could find in our cabinet to drink coffee while discussing the July 4th elections. All 650 seats in the House of Commons up for grabs. You need 326 for a majority. New York Times reporting Prime Minister Keir Starmer took office in Britain today. Sam, they don't muck around with this interregnum and lame duck for months on end. No, Starmer's in.
From what I gather, it's like an hour.
Yeah, like pack up and go. Yeah, and so Starmer, he promised national renewal. His center-left Labour Party won a landslide election victory, decisively swept the Conservatives, a.k.a. the Tories, out of power for the first time in 14 years. 410 seats for Labour, so they've got a robust majority. That's the characterization by the New York Times. But Labour only picked up 35% of the votes nationwide. It's the lowest share of the vote won by any single-party majority government, according to a prominent polling expert. Meanwhile, the Tories, who, as we mentioned, had a 14-year run in power, on course for fewer than 130 seats, 130 out of 650. That would constitute the worst defeat in the nearly 200-year history of the British Conservative Party.
One of the oldest parties on earth.
Yeah. So, Sam, I don't know what you want to pick out of this, but I've got the obviously Labour landslide, but low turnout. So that's a little makes it tricky. Tories, worst showing in 200 years. And then the Reform Party and Nigel Farage, who they're essentially the British MAGA. They're your Eurosceptic is the term. They're anti-immigration hardline.
Yeah, I'd say Eurosceptic Farage, is putting it mildly.
Mildly, right. Yeah. So Farage won a seat in the parliament, and his party won 4 and also helped decimate the Tories' performance. Is that a fair characterization?
I mean, they did help, but I don't know how. I mean, if they only got 4 seats. But let's back up a little bit. They did manage to become I believe, the 3rd largest party in Parliament. So they got a lot of votes.
Yes, they did.
The British first past the post system, as they call it, didn't allot them 4 seats, whereas the early exit polls last night seemed to indicate they might get as many as 10 seats. And the pre-election polls thought that they might get more than a dozen seats. So the actual number of seats they got, it should be sort of disappointing for them. Nigel Farage, as you say, finally won a seat in Parliament for the first time, although he's been a prominent figure in British politics for quite a while now. That number of years. He was, of course, one of the early and loudest advocates, and I do mean loudest, for the Brexit movement.
Yeah, he basically was the figurehead of Brexit in the UK.
For quite a long time. But it's only now that he's actually been able to win a seat in Parliament. So that's a little odd. But I think that there's a widespread consensus that even though this is an enormous victory for Labour, it's really more of a defeat for the Tories, that is the Conservative Party. And as you mentioned, they've been in power for 14 years, and that's a long time. However, before that, the Labour Party was in power for 13 years. And before that, the Conservatives were in power again for 19 years. So I think as much as I dislike the pendulum metaphor that's so often employed in small d democratic politics, it just seems that the British political system leads to long spells in power for one of the main parties or another, right? So it's 19, 14, 13. That's a long time. And it just seems again, to be a sort of structural element. So we might say that this was just sort of Labor's turn, uh, except for the really dismal showing of the Conservative Party throughout their term in office, almost from the beginning. For instance, I think a lot of people would have to admit that the biggest mistake they made was when the prime minister that won the government back for the Conservatives, David Cameron, in 2010, who was then governing for his first 5-year term in a coalition with the Liberal Democrats, called for the Brexit referendum after winning the outright majority in the election of 2015. And this is where all the trouble started. And that's pretty early on. And
may I point out, he called for the Brexit referendum as a Remainer. He was trying to stamp it out.
That's right. And he said that if voters gave him a majority in 2015, as opposed to the coalition government he was sitting in with the Liberal Democrats from 2010 through 2015, he promised that he would call for the referendum and then campaign against the idea of leaving the European Union. Didn't work out for him. The Brexit referendum passed very narrowly. And since then, they've had 4 subsequent prime ministers. And this is what differentiates them from the previous long spells in government that Labour and his own party have had. Labour, during their 13 years in power, only had 2 prime ministers, and really almost only one. Gordon Brown was only, Tony Blair. Gordon Brown was only prime minister for a very short period of time. And the Conservative Party from 1978 through 1997, again, only had 2 prime ministers. And so 5 is a lot, all right? And it just speaks to the chaos that engulfed the party after the Brexit referendum passed.
Essentially, the Tories called for the Brexit referendum, trying to stamp it out. I mean, we should point out this is unique to Britain, or it's very different to the U.S. in that remaining in the U.K. versus Brexit, that went across party lines. There were people who wanted to remain, who wanted to leave. It was not a partisan divide. So essentially, Brexit passes, I think, like 51-49.
Yes, it was very narrow.
2016. This was a catastrophic. I mean, we could do a whole episode about Brexit, but essentially since then, the Conservatives, the Tories, have been trying to find the right leader to help sort out what the voters wanted. And that was kind of Boris Johnson's pitch. And maybe he did it a little bit. I mean, the decoupling from Europe is like the most Gordian knot imaginable. Right.
Yeah, and
it's like it's just an administrative nightmare. It remains one in the United Kingdom. And it transcends party politics. Right.
Yeah. So this is what British people might call an own goal for the Conservative Party. Right.
Yes.
I think
good one.
At the time of Brexit, many people, especially economists, said this will damage Britain's long-term economic growth prospects, right? It'll be difficult for them to generate high levels of economic growth if they leave the European Union. And I think we can say that that's almost certainly been true. But they also had like everybody else, a terrible misfortune befall them, which was the COVID-19 pandemic, which damaged very severely their short-term growth potential, right? So they might have been able to get by with lower long-term growth, but as soon as short-term growth was wiped out by the pandemic, this meant they basically, that economic growth just collapsed for them. And by the way, Keir Starmer, that is Sir Keir Starmer, the new Prime Minister of Britain, that has been his main campaign promise, which is to restore economic growth to Britain. And I think that's astute. He's not been very specific about that. Mainly his main campaign promise, although unspoken, is that we won't be the Conservatives, right? We might say that Labour has just campaigned as the non-conservative party.
Other notes about what Starmer's messaging contained: a changed Labor Party was his
Yes.
huge message, and I believe he said "change" about 6 times in his first sentence in his victory speech. I mean, it's a change, 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 change was essentially the messaging
Yes.
from the changed Labor Party and Starmer, and it worked.
Yes. I mean, but again, I think just not being the Tories was the most
Yeah.
important thing. Everybody's just so tired of them. And it'll be interesting, I believe, in September when they have their leadership contest to see what direction they go in. Because as we mentioned, the Reform Party got a good deal of votes. So some people believe that the conservatives will try and veer right to recapture some of the people that they've lost to reform, whereas other people think that they might try and become more of a centrist party and see the error of their ways. It's difficult to say. I don't know anywhere near enough about British politics to say how that process is going to go. And I should say, a lot of British people are curious about this too. I don't think it's just my ignorance that makes this hard to call.
Well, I think you also would need, if you're the Tories and you want to stake out the middle ground, you're going to need Labor to cooperate, right? Starmer would have to be maybe more left than initially thought by a lot of voters in order for them to carve out that territory.
I think that's right. And I think he'll avoid doing that.
I suspect he would be kind of more in the Blair Clinton triangulation. I mean, again, I'm not the one who knows British politics in my household, but like going through the parade of clowns and the prime ministership that the Tories have run up there. So Cameron calls for Brexit hopes to stamp it out. Unfortunately for him, Brexit goes through. Then you have Theresa May, who after Brexit she was appointed, then called a snap election. I mean, that's the other thing. There are term limits, but the prime minister can call an election essentially to like take the temperature of their political capital, which
well,
is
not
kind
only
of
that, but to try to give herself her own political mandate to see Brexit through.
So Cameron calls for the referendum and loses. Brexit goes through. May becomes prime minister, then calls a snap election to help kind of boost her own political standing, narrowly wins.
Yes.
Then Johnson comes on with his bluster and says, "I'll sort out Brexit." COVID happens. I think he's having a party the same day that the Queen is sitting by herself at her husband's funeral because of COVID restrictions, right? So
that's right.
People sour on Boris, who's like
not only that, but at the beginning
chaotic character to begin with.
At the beginning of the pandemic, he thought that the best course of action would be to just let it run its course.
Right,
I mean,
right.
His handling of the pandemic was
atrocious,
terrible. Yeah.
And then you have Liz Truss, who lasted a week, famously lasted not as long as a head of lettuce.
Correct.
But did
lost her seat last night, by the way.
Yes, she did. And also killed the Queen. Didn't kill the Queen, but like was, presided when the Queen died. And then it's been Rishi Sunak, who, as you so astutely put a couple episodes ago, appears to have been looking for the exit for quite some time.
Yes. And there was a quip in The Economist about a month ago, actually, already, where they said he seems to, and I'm paraphrasing here, that he seems to treat being prime minister for 2 years as something to put on his LinkedIn profile, which I thought was...
It's a pretty good line.
Yeah. But yeah, he left the D-Day commemoration to do a television interview back in Britain. And not only that, but when he showed up for the interview, while he was on camera, he apologized for showing up late, saying that the D-Day event he'd been at had run long. I mean, it's just like, how could you actually be the prime minister? But
read the room, buddy.
Yeah, or read something.
Now, again, we should point out to anybody who cares about the British Isles, like, American politics is also heinous right now. But it was that, and also in watching the coverage on the BBC, there is kind of there is a lack of animosity animating British politics that is certainly absent here. Rishi Sunak had the lovely concession speech, right? He accepted full responsibility, said, "I've heard the voters' anger." I mean, it's just the tone of the coverage is, well, we'll contrast it with France. and perhaps kind of just, implicitly the United States, right? It just was a much more civic, if
Yeah.
not civil, affair in the
Almost
UK.
stately, really. I mean,
Truly,
yeah.
yeah. Any other thoughts on the UK election, or can
No,
we
I mean, we could,
look at
I don't want
France?
to just, bash the conservatives all day long. I mean, we could
Well, but
go.
it's been funny.
Well, it has been, but their litany of errors has been so lengthy and so severe that we could literally talk about this for hours and not finish with it.
Right. And it's more funny when you realize it's the party of Winston Churchill and Margaret Thatcher.
Yes, but now it's the party of Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, right? And so it's going to take some time, perhaps, I don't know, 13 to 14 years for them to live this down. Although, I mean, Keir Starmer's not going to have an easy time of it. For instance, when Tony Blair took office in 1997, the British economy was doing great. It was really, again, at that point, just that the Tories had been in office for so long that people had gotten tired of them. But he had house money to play with, right? Keir Starmer does not have that. Right. And it'll be tricky for him to figure out what to do. He says he wants to restore growth, but without rejoining the European Union, how's he really going to do that?
Just to quickly kind of thumbnail sketch about the British economic situation right now.
Awful.
They had a recession. They've come out of it.
Yes.
Their energy costs are catastrophic.
Yes.
What am I missing? Oh, they've got an immigration crisis, or at least that's a big political issue. I don't know how impactful that is on the economy specifically. Like
it's actually probably helping them.
Right. As immigration often does.
No, but child poverty is at a record high.
And the NHS. And the NHS is grossly overlogged since COVID.
That's right. And this is partly because one of the first things Cameron did upon taking office back in 2010, again, from the very beginning of the conservative mandate, was to slash public services. Now, of course, this was in the immediate aftermath of the financial crisis, right? But this was a terrible idea, right? It's a very sort of popular conservative idea, no matter what country you're in, right? But it was a bad idea then, just as it is almost every time anybody does it.
All right, jolly good. That's enough on British politics.
Yes.
But special relationship, Okay, France. Dateline Paris, Reuters reporting today, Friday, July 5th. Parties across the political spectrum urged French voters to vote massively on Sunday. That's the final round of this two-round election, to tilt the outcome. As opinion polls forecast, the far right would be the largest party. But right now, the polls don't show them winning an absolute majority. So I looked this up, you need 289 seats in the National Assembly.
Yes. And just to interject here for a moment, right? There are 577 seats in the lower house of the French Parliament, a nation of 67 million people or something like that. Yeah. There are 600 some odd seats in the British Parliament, a nation of what, 80 million? Okay, 57 million people. Yeah. Much smaller nations than our nation at 330 million. Our House of Representatives has 435 members. And so one thing that we should say about both Britain and France is that their constituencies, that is the legislative districts, are much smaller than ours are. There are
power is diluted.
Yeah, there are fewer people in them. And so I just wanted to make sure I pointed that out. Please go on, John.
Okay. So you need 289 seats to have a majority in the lower house. Okay. The Rassemblement National, that's the National Rally, Marine Le Pen, Eurosceptic, anti-immigration.
Yes, we'll call them the RN from now on, just at the same time.
The RN.
Yeah.
They're hardline anti-immigrant. They got a third of the vote in the opening round, but the polls don't show them getting to 289 in this round. And it says in various reporting that I've read that there have been kind of strategic alliances of opposition parties to make sure that RN will not win seats that maybe they were positioned to after the first round of voting.
Yes, that's right. And this is very complicated. So
It's
we
like
might,
a stop Trump, but it's more
yeah,
spread
and
out.
it's for one thing that I learned this week, literally about French elections that I didn't know before, is that it's sort of like British elections, and that unlike most European countries, they do not apportion seats in the legislature through any system of proportional representation. It is like the first past the post system in France. I'm sorry, the first past the post system in Great Britain. That is, whoever gets the most votes in any seat for any seat wins the seat. So if there's three candidates, you don't even need a majority, right? Whereas in a proportional representation system, the seats are apportioned to parties in line with their percentage of the national vote total in most cases. There are different kinds of proportional representation system. But so what that means is that if you're obviously the incumbent in a proportional representation system, you're campaigning essentially to hold your seat, right? But if you're not the incumbent, if you're just a local politician someplace in Germany, for example, right, you're campaigning for the party, and you hope that if your party wins enough seats, you'll be the person in your district to be assigned the seat, but you're not the candidate for that seat.
That is different.
It is different. So, but in France, it operates more the way it does in Britain and actually here in the United States. You're campaigning for the seat, even if you're the opposition candidate. And so, what's happened is if you need 12.5% in the first round to go through to the second round. That means there can still be three-way races in the second round. And so what's happened is the party of the sitting president, Emmanuel Macron, has agreed essentially with the leftist bloc, the Nouveau Front Populaire, or the NFP, as we'll call them, right? To
New Popular Front in
the
English.
New Popular Front, yes, to stand down candidates who placed third in the first round in particular districts. Now, some of them have not agreed to do this, but more than there were 300 possible three-way races coming out of the first round, and something like 225 third place finishers agreed to drop out.
Wow.
And so this is what they're calling the Republican Front to try and stop the far right from gaining the outright majority in the parliament. And it looks like it's going to work, but we won't find out until Sunday when the second round election actually happens.
All right. So
I'm
the New
sorry
Popular.
that was very
No, it's okay. It's like, look, they have three-way races. And although Francois Hollande and the New Popular Front, they're not new. They're the old kind of liberal bloc. And
no,
the
but they also
president,
include the very far left,
sure.
La France Insoumise. I mean, which is not
And that is new.
inconsiderable.
That is new,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
That alignment.
exactly. Yeah.
And their mortal enemy, the centrists, Macron, have decided, look, it's like an anti-Trump coalition. Like, we need to do this to make sure that these right-wing nut jobs don't take over our government.
Yes, and it looks like it's going to work. But it'll
I mean, the RN will still get a majority, but they won't, or they will have the biggest plurality, I should say.
They will have a plurality. Yeah.
But they will have to work well, there's actually a couple. There could be a caretaker government. There could be a coalition. They have a couple different ways they could do it.
Yeah.
But
this is one reason why this is such an interesting story, is because nobody knows exactly how this kind of government is going to function, right? Macron, as president, will have to appoint a prime minister from some other party in what they call a cohabitation government, right? And this has happened before, but it's always been the mainstream left party cohabitating with the mainstream right party. It's never been want a center party cohabitating with, either the far
Hard right. Yeah.
or this weird coalition of all the leftist parties put together who don't necessarily all get along.
Unless you think we're just kind of, liberals clutching our pearls, like the last far right government in France was the Vichy collaboratist government that got with the Nazis in World War II and Philippe Pétain, right?
Yes, and
now I don't know. I'm not saying Marine Le Pen's a Nazi, but it's in that direction.
Sure,
it's not good.
Well, look, I mean, many people were very comfortable calling her father, the founder of her party, a Nazi, right? I mean, I didn't have any qualms about that whatsoever, and she certainly softened the stance, her sort of rhetoric around it.
Sure.
But many people think that she's actually entirely unreconstructed, and much like the Vichy government, they have, that is, the RN has attracted some number of mainstream conservatives from what's called the Republican Party, formerly the main center-right party in France, and now a battered shell of its former self, polling at something like 10%. We a couple of weeks ago, after the first round, we talked about the episode of the Republican Party president, Eric Ciotti, barricading himself inside party headquarters. But it might have occurred to us at that time that COT probably wouldn't have done something like this if he didn't think he was bringing other people with him. And it does seem as though he is. And that could be the deciding factor. If he can bring enough people with him from the Republican Party, he might be able to form a right-wing coalition government with the RN. It seems unlikely, but it's not. We cannot rule it out.
So the polling right now shows the RN, the far right, the Le Pen party in front, and then the New Popular Front in second, and then the Macron centrist bloc in third. That's what the polling shows.
One of the reasons I went into such excruciating detail about how the system works is because, as Claire Paquelin, who's a reporter on France 24, pointed out very astutely, because it's not a proportional system, you essentially have 577 local races. And so the pre-election polling doesn't tell you who's going to win every seat, right? In a proportional system, the percentages would be what decides how the seats are apportioned. And that's not the way it's going to work in France. For instance, the RN could get 80% of the vote in one district, but they would still only get one seat. That wouldn't help them win any other seats, right? So everything's on the table still to this day.
The Interior Minister of France, Gérald Darmanin, said that at least 51 candidates and their supporters had been physically harmed, quite a few of them while putting up campaign posters. He told a television outlet, quote, "Outbreaks of violence are to be feared on Sunday." And he didn't specify a party. But then later on in this Reuters report, they quoted an attorney in Paris saying the British should count themselves lucky, just contrasting the very stately tone of the British election to, what's looking like a bit of a barroom brawl in France.
Yeah, honestly, I mean, in Britain, it did kind of feel rather routine, whereas the French, they'll all tell you this is unprecedented. They've never seen anything like this, and it's very unstable and frightening for them.
I'm going to put you on the spot because I suspect you've been following. I'm pretty sure you've been following kind of the rhetoric of RN and Le Pen in more detail than I have. But is Le Pen's party, the far right RN, are they more explicitly kind of anti-constitutional, like in a MAGA sense, or are they just kind of racist?
They're just very racist and xenophobic, I would say. They're very anti-European institutions. They're rather anti-EU and anti-NATO. They don't seem to want to mess around with the French Constitution as far as we can tell.
Right. I mean, if RN got power and had a majority, is a Frexit a possibility?
They've counted that out. Le Pen used to
Okay.
talk about that
Yeah,
and
but
stopped. And
kinder, gentler Le Pen, sure. Yeah.
yeah, right. But the relations with the European Union would certainly take a turn for the worse.
Right. Okay.
We'll
Get
see
out the
on
vote,
Sunday.
France.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, Bolivia.
Yes, just an update
Oh, yeah.
on Bolivia from last week.
Okay. So,
And our listeners will recall that there was apparently an attempted coup,
yeah,
but then one of the main coup plotter came out and said, no, this was all a hoax.
right. So, reporting from the Associated Press yesterday, the leader of Bolivia's retired service members, so this is a retired general, Tomas Peña y Leo, telling the Associated Press, quote, it's a tragic comedy. He's now a fugitive, wanted for his participation in the alleged coup attempt. He said he was surprised to receive a call the morning of the coup, which was what, June 26th, like 8 days ago,
Yes.
from the army chief, the coup plotter, Juan Jose Zuniga, with a request to report for talks about how to advocate for imprisoned soldiers. Anyway, it, he basically, I just loved his quote that it was a tragic comedy. But just to recap, Zuniga, the chief of the army, attempted to take over the presidential palace last week. The incumbent Luis Arce has struggled to address a looming financial crisis.
Yes,
But
when in fact, a more, I would say, very large economic crisis, not just
sure,
financial, right?
sure. So, right, they got a problem. But then after he was arrested, Zuniga said the coup attempt was a ruse masterminded by the incumbent Arce to drum up popular support. And Arce is split with the popular predecessor, Evo Morales.
Yes, that's right. And when we were discussing this last week, we both agreed that this seemed like a very implausible story. But
Farcical.
apparently, but apparently many Bolivians do not believe it to be implausible. They find this to be a credible story.
And I'll tell you why.
Go on.
Bolivia, this is Wikipedia, Bolivia has experienced more than 190 coups d'etat, like Whoppers Jr. or attorneys general, coups d'etat and revolutions since its independence in 1825. Here's an even better one, Sam. Since 1950, Bolivia has seen the most coups of any country. The last one was in 1984. So from 1949 to 1964, 15 years, there were 6 coups d'etat in Bolivia. From 1966 to 1984, 18 years, there were 9.
Wow.
Coach, that's a lot of coups.
That's a lot of coups. And so, but then that's what speaks to this whole plot, right? If you're any Bolivian president, in this case, Luis Arce, right, you know that even if you're the guy who appointed the head of the armed forces, that guy you appointed might be coming for you at any time, right?
Yep.
And if you're the head of the armed forces, you know that many people who've had your job or similar jobs to yours have successfully taken over your government, right? So there's this sort of mutual distrust just built into Bolivian politics from the get-go. So the idea is, which I only was able to piece together this week, because there was very little good reporting coming out of Bolivia, right? Is that, as you say, Arce was the former protege and now adversary of the former president Evo Morales, who's still very popular, although not as popular as he used to be. He himself was deposed in a coup and fled into exile, has returned, but still holds sway in the legislature, at least to the extent that his loyalists have blocked Arce from being able to do anything about the economic crisis, including, by the way, exploiting their enormous reserves of lithium, which could be an economic lifeline to the country, but are now sitting there unused by anybody because of Evo's blockage. And so the idea
That's terrible.
Yeah, it's awful. I mean, Evo tried to stay in power forever, right? He was in power for a very long time. He tried to change the constitution, no dice. But the idea is that Arce went to Zuniga and said, "Oh, woe is me. I'm not powerful enough to withstand the opposition of Evo. So we need a patriotic leader such as yourself, General Zuniga, to save the country." Right. So what I want you to do is speak out against Evo, who's very active on social media. And so Zuniga said that he would stop Evo from returning to power. Right. Speak out against him, and then I'll fire you to give you the pretext for you to take over the country, and you'll save the country. Now, apparently, General Zuniga was stupid enough to believe this, right? He didn't see this as a trap being set for him, if that's what happened, right? But so he'd indeed launched the coup.
It failed.
Yeah, Arce stood him down in front of the television cameras and emerged as the defender of Bolivian democracy. Now, this could be true. It could all be made up. In fact, Evo Morales has come out and said that he believes General Zuniga, that this was all a hoax. But we don't know if that's actually true. It's just, it's a fascinating story. And there's quite a lot we could say about Bolivia, more than we've been able to have time for today. But this could be ongoing. So we could be returning to this topic very soon.
Everybody, hope you enjoy the rest of your 4th of July weekend. Happy Independence Day.
Next week, we'll be talking about, of course, the end of the second round of the French elections. Voting has been extended in Iran today for their second round of the presidential election. And then next week will also be our 2024 Electorama halftime spectacular show. So you'll want to be certain to tune in for that.
All right. He's Sam. I'm John. Peace.
Thanks, everybody.